This was the summer before last. Heat so thick the air felt wrong. I'm not great with open windows at night, but that week I'd left mine cracked because the apartment was sweltering. I worked late that night and didn't get in until around midnight. It was quiet in the hallway, just the hum of the building's AIC and someone 2 floors up moving around. I unlocked my door, stepped in, and noticed immediately my bedroom light was on. I'll be honest, my first thought was that I'd left it on earlier. I flicked the switch off, shrugged it off, and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. 2 minutes later, I heard the faucet shut off in the bathroom upstairs. Not a pipe sound, a faucet. I froze. It was a sound I wouldn't have noticed except that I live alone and I don't have a guest. I pressed my ear to the floor and listened. The building was otherwise silent. After a few 10 seconds, the bathroom faucet upstairs stopped and footsteps padded away down the hall. Someone was in the building. I don't make a habit of confronting strangers in hallways at midnight, so I stayed put and called the building manager. No answer. I texted a neighbor I knew was night shift and got no reply. I told myself I was overreacting and started to head upstairs just to check the landing. Halfway there, I heard a soft scratch, like a fingernail on glass, coming from my bedroom window. It was a cracked window. Something or someone was at the exterior. My heart kicked, and I moved as quietly as I could back toward the door. I grabbed a small kitchen knife I keep in the drawer, not because I thought it would do much, but because holding something made me feel less helpless, and crept to the bedroom. The curtain was sitting still, but there was a wet smear of condensation on the inside of the glass where someone had pressed their palm. The smear started at eye level and trailed down like a fingerprint mapping. I peeled the curtain aside and saw nothing outside but the brick ledge and the alley light far below. I locked the deadbolt, wrapped myself in a hoodie, and sat on the floor with my back against the door. My phone buzzed, a missed call from an unknown number. I opened my voicemail. It was a short recording, heavy breathing, a pause, the low voice saying, "You could have waved." That was it. No laugh, no threat, just that sentence. I've never felt my skin crawl so much. I called the manager again. This time he answered and said he'd come up. He knocked on my door 5 minutes later. I threw it open without thinking. He was an older guy who knew almost everyone in the building by name. He walked through the apartment, checked the windows and the rooftop access, and left after reassuring me it looked clear. I should have felt better, but I didn't. The next morning, I went through my camera footage from the hallway. There was a frame around 11:48 p.m. of a figure in a dark hoodie coming up the stairs and pausing at my floor. The camera angle was low and the face wasn't visible, but there was something else in the frame. The figure tilting their head toward the window of my unit, then turning and tucking something into the inside pocket of the hoodie before continuing. I zoomed in, enhanced it as best as my software would allow, and what looked like a single folded napkin or slip of paper became clear when I brightened the image. The person had a small square of white being tucked away. That evening after work, I opened the front door and found that same small square of folded paper on my welcome mat. Whoever had been outside had slipped it under the door when I wasn't there. Inside, in the same handwriting as the voicemail's cadence, was a single line. "Nice view. Wave next time." No signature. No return address. Just that note. I moved out 2 weeks later. I never saw that person again, and nothing else happened. No broken windows. No more messages. But sometimes when I'm home late and the apartment's warm at night, I still find myself glancing at the window, counting the seconds between streetlights, and imagining a hand pressed to the glass. That evening after work, I opened the front door and found that same small square of folded paper on my welcome mat. Whoever had been outside had slipped it under the door when I wasn't there. Inside, in the same handwriting as the voicemail's cadence, was a single line. "Nice view. Wave next time." No signature. No return address. Just that note. I moved out 2 weeks later. I never saw that person again, and nothing else happened. No broken windows. No more messages. But sometimes when I'm home late and the apartment's warm at night, I still find myself glancing at the window, counting the seconds between streetlights, and imagining a hand pressed to the glass. I sat up. I had the chain on and the deadbolt locked. I could hear someone pacing back and forth outside my door like they were testing it, listening for movement. I slid my phone to 911 and whispered into it, barely moving. The operator said police would try to respond, but motels at 2 a.m. on a slow highway aren't usually high priority. The pacing outside turned into a soft tapping, like a long fingernail drawn along the wood. Then, suddenly, a rustling, not with shoes but with something that dragged. I flicked the light on, stood up, and went to the peephole. The hallway was empty. I cracked the door just enough to peek out into the lamplight corridor and saw footprints. Not shoe prints, but wet, dark smudges on the mat right in front of my door. They led away toward the stairwell and then stopped. The smell of diesel and wet earth was there, too, thick like someone had come from outside in a truck. I left the chain engaged and called the front desk on the room phone. The clerk answered and his voice was sleepy. "Everything okay, sir?" I told him about the sound and the footprints. He said he'd check the cameras. There were 2 cameras in the hallway, and neither showed anyone approaching my door. The footage jumped from 231 to 244. A blank gap. "Must be a glitch," he said, but his voice wasn't convincing. He said he'd come up. Before he arrived, I heard my sliding window, the small motel window that faces a parking lot, creak open. It's a different kind of sound in the door, a soft, ghostly squeal where metal meets frame. Whoever had been at my door was now by the window. I padded over, put my hand on the sill, and the glass was warm like someone had been leaning on it. A single smear of something dark traced across the pane at face level, then trailed down like a thumbprint. The clerk and another motel employee came up and banged on my door. We opened it and searched, and there were no signs of forced entry. All the cars in the lot were accounted for. A pickup with a sagging tailgate, a sedan, and an RV with a generator running. But when they checked the RV, the owner was inside asleep and had no idea what we were talking about. The clerk played back the camera only to show the same gap. The whole building felt small and exposed. The next morning, in the daylight, the manager showed me the parking lot footage from the only working camera outside. There at 1:58 a.m. was a dark van pulling into the lot and idling. The van sat with its engine running for 10 minutes, then turned off and stayed dark. At 2:29 a.m., a figure stepped out, walked right past the camera frame, and then reappeared at 2:43 a.m. walking back to the van. But the person's gait was wrong, almost like they were dragging something that didn't appear on camera. At 3:02 a.m., the van left. There were no license plates visible. I drove away that morning earlier than planned. A month later, I saw a short article about a man who'd been arrested a few towns over for breaking into motel rooms and rifling through guest belongings while they slept. He was never caught in the act, but they'd found a pile of guest items in a storage unit, along with duct tape and a thermal blanket. They suspected he'd been scouting motels on that highway for months. I've never slept fully without locking every possible entry since then. Even now, when I'm on a trip, I find myself checking the deadbolt in the window at odd hours and watching the shadow of the lot outside, waiting for a van that never arrives. The last one happened on a late fall weekend at a friend's lake house. She invited a few of us upstate to decompress after a brutal week. I'd only been once before, and that time the lake was caged in mist. This visit, we were the only guests. She booked it off-season to have the place to ourselves. It was gorgeous in a desolate way. Bare trees, the lake black and still, and the wooden dock creaking softly in the wind. We stayed up playing cards and telling stupid jokes, until one by one we drifted off. I fell asleep on the couch because I couldn't bear to go to bed in the cold bedroom. At around 3:10 a.m., I woke to the smell of smoke and something metallic. My friend Claire was awake in the armchair, quiet and pale. She said she'd heard somebody walking on the dock. We both listened. The house was alive with the usual night sounds. The refrigerator hummed, the old plumbing, but under it, a rhythm like slow footsteps on wood measured and deliberate, coming from the back door which faces a lake. I went to the back door, its sliding glass that looks right out onto the dock, and peered through. There was nothing on the dock, but there were fresh prints in the dew on the wooden boards, like someone had walked the length of it and then stopped halfway to peer in. The prints were barefoot. They were spaced oddly, like the walker was taking tiny, careful steps. One print was closer to the door than the others, as if the person had leaned close to the glass and looked in for a moment. Claire locked every door, and we sat with the lights on, awkward and waiting for something to happen. After an hour, the footsteps started again, but this time across the lawn, slow, crunching through frosted leaves toward the side window. We called a non-emergency line for the county sheriff, and they assured us someone would check, but warned it might take time. We had no cell service, but the house had a landline. The operator stayed on the line while we waited. The footsteps stopped just outside our bedroom window, and there was a faint scratch, not a claws, but a scraping that sounded like someone running their fingers across a glass. Claire whispered that she'd once seen a movie where someone traced letters on a window. I laughed because the situation felt ridiculous. Then my laugh died when we both heard a sound like a hand making a cup and gently thumping the glass twice. We turned on the outside lights. The beam swept empty grass, the sagging dock, the black water. Nothing. The sheriff's truck arrived 20 minutes later, and 2 deputies walked the perimeter with flashlights. They found prints leading away from the dock into the trees, but nothing beyond that. The prints disappeared where the ground sloped, as if the person had simply melted into the underbrush. We stayed awake the rest of the night in the living room. At dawn, before the deputies left, I stepped outside alone to take a picture of the lake. The dock was empty, the prints scrubbed by an overnight rain that had moved through, and the only thing left on the glass back door was a faint, oily smear at face height, the outline of a hand. It was damp and dark, the kind of print that felt like it belonged to someone who'd been in the water or had paint on their hands. The smear had 2 short lines across the palm, as if someone had intentionally marked it. We never learned who'd been out there or why. The sheriff filed it as trespassing with no evidence. Claire's landlord said sometimes kids go out to the lake and play at night, but the prints were too big for local kids, and the marks on the window didn't match anything they could think of. The thing that unsettled me most was that faint pattern across the palm, 2 short lines, which, if you squinted, looked like initials. Maybe it was a smear, maybe it was nothing, but every time I return to the city and walk past a lake at night now, I feel that itch at the back of my neck like someone is standing a yard away on the dark water, watching.